Hello, I'm going to get this comment out of the way right at the beginning. I'm sorry about all of the glaring lights on my glasses. I don't know what people with glasses are supposed to do about this. I've tried to do my ambient lighting with my candle and my Smisky. Today I'm going to be tier listing all the books that I read in 2025, which is a total of 89 books, which is crazy. That's a huge amount of books. I am so proud of myself, and also I feel like it was a very interesting year of books. Now, I'm not typically someone who enjoys tier listing. Sometimes I watch other people tier list. It's not something that I thought I would ever be interested in doing myself, but I saw Frankie's Shelves video the other day where he did the same. I realized it was a great way to talk about all the other books that I've yet to talk about, because there are quite a few books out there that I didn't talk about. I only started making videos again halfway through the year, and I feel like there are a lot that are worth talking about. I think it's also a nice way to reflect on what I read last year and how much I retained what I read and what held value for me as well. So the way that we're going to do this, I'm not going to include any DNFs. I'm going to be ignoring the star ratings that I gave these books. I'm a very harsh critic, but I've made my own categories specifically to try and avoid like the very critical part of myself and to focus more on, like, in a fun way, what are these books. I will also be trying to give an overview of the plot from memory, probably very badly for some of them, so you guys have a bit of an idea of what each book is about. There are a few books here that are volumes 9 to 11 of a series that I've read, which I find very difficult to summarize without spoiling. We'll give it a try. So to explain the categories briefly, would buy a second copy. For me, this is the highest praise. If I've bought you a copy of a book, it means that it is one of my favorite books ever. That's the top tier. Next down we have Delectable. This is something that was really close to being a favorite, and I cannot deny was amazing or very entertaining for me, but definitely wasn't right at the top. Then it was okay/good. This is for the ones that I can't say that I'm indifferent about. These are the ones that I would find it difficult to say that I was indifferent or that I couldn't remember what happened in the plot, but it still wasn't something that I necessarily enjoyed. It was just okay. Indifferent. Now, this is kind of also a category for like forgettable things that I was not really hugely into. I forgot what happened, or I just felt like very absent or indifferent. That is why it's the name of the category. The next one is actively disliked. Is when I'm a hater. I was being a hater and I did not enjoy it. I did not find a lot of value in it at all. And then the final bottom category is get in the bin. These are for the things that I would get rid of my copy. I don't want to own the book anymore. I don't want to think or talk about the book, or I hate it so much that I will have like a full-blown rant about it. Those are the categories that we're working with here. And here are the 89 books that I read. I think that's it. I think that's all I've got to say. Let's get into the books that I read in 2025. The first book I read was volume 7 of The Husky and His White Cat Season. This is where I'm going to struggle to summarize what happens, but this is part of like a wider ranging Danmei series that I've been into for a little while now. Basically, I've been following every volume as they have been physically published. I think the final volume is coming out this year. It's 2026. If you're familiar with Danmei, it is like ancient Chinese cultivation, a lot of long-haired, beautiful men who have to fight monsters, and also a lot of political intrigue, drama, a lot of relationships. This story in particular follows Moran, who gets a second chance at life when he is reincarnated into his younger self. In his previous life, he ends his life early after wreaking absolute havoc on his world. He is an evil emperor who has murdered, raped, pillaged, all of the above, and has taken his previous cultivation teacher captive because he hates him so much. But does he hate him? After he kills himself, he reawakes in his younger self's body, realizing he has a chance to reinvent himself and live his life a second time round and not repeat his mistakes. And it's funny, it's devastating, it is very dark. There's going to be a lot of relationship dynamics and things that people will not like about this story. For me, am I in it for the romance? Not so much. I'm in it for the world building, for the humor in how horrific things become. I'd say for most of this series, they would belong in the delectable tier, because I would not buy a second copy. It is not my favorite of all time, but I cannot say that I have not consistently enjoyed this story. Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. People are going to hate me for this one. I really did not enjoy Ariadne. Ariadne is another somewhat feminist retelling of a myth. Ariadne is the daughter of King Minos, who has the labyrinth with the Minotaur, right? A very popular story. And this was interesting because the story focuses mainly on Ariadne and her sister as they're growing up alongside the Minotaur as this feared figure. And the family dynamics are very interestingly explored. As with a lot of mythical retellings, you see Ariadne's essentially entire life. What really kicks off this book is when Theseus comes to the island to defeat the Minotaur, and many more things happen after that. And what I commend this story for is it is centering Ariadne's story, something that perhaps hasn't been done previously. I can't help but feel, though, with mythical retellings that they stand very heavily on the shoulders of their predecessors. So when you go read the back of this book, it's going to be talking about Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles and Circe, and maybe even The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which is up there. I have not read that one yet. And after reading Ariadne, I don't know if I want to read another mythic retelling. I feel like 2020 onwards, there was like a huge boom in feminist retellings of myths, and I don't think a lot of them were actually that good, which is really sad because I think the concept could be done so well. There's a huge wealth of stories and rich and interesting characters to be drawing from. Ariadne sadly just did nothing for me. I don't feel like she was hugely her own character. The ending was so depressing, and I know this is a myth. You're not going to be going to myths most of the time for feel-good stories, but I don't feel that the way that it was presented had any impact on me other than just feeling very underwhelmed and just like, that was it, I guess. The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, the comic volume, I'm looking at the screen, the tiny little cover of this book, and I don't know what volume that is. Volume 6. I've talked about a later volume in one of my videos. This is a comic or manhwa adaptation of the books Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, which I gave most of my opinions about the way that the artist draws action scenes, and this is one of my favorite stories. For volume 6, I'm going to put it at it was okay/good. I've talked about my opinions on these books and the adaptation specifically in one of my videos, the November reading vlog, I think. I have a little bit of issue with how the action scenes are presented. I find it very confusing, muddy, just kind of difficult to understand what's going on. And that's a huge shame because this is one of my favorite stories, and if I hadn't read books or watched the TV show prior to reading the manhwa, I would have been so confused, and I have already been so confused by it. So I'm going to say it was okay/good. Most of that is my loyalty to the book. It is one of my comfort series. Just very exciting to me to see it visualized. The TV show is obviously censored, so you don't get to see like their romance actually blossom. But this is another Danmei series. The way that the story is often explained is the main character Wei Wuxian and his life, his rebirth, his death, so on and so forth. Once again, another Danmei that is set in a world of magical cultivation where humans ascend to immortality and fight ghosts, demons, with a lot of political drama and intrigue. Is it wrong to use violent means to protect an oppressed people? Things like that. Very interesting. I am in it for the romance of this one, absolutely. The Right to Sex. This was a book club read. I am part of Hannah Witton's Patreon, and they have a book club. This was the first book of the book club that I read. I was super excited to get involved in it, and yeah, I think this was a pretty decent book. I'm going to say that it was okay/good. It was decent. I think it was very heavy. Even though I think it was great, I'm not going to say that it was delectable just because it's nonfiction. I'm going to preface now, I feel like for a lot of the nonfiction books on this list, it's going to be hard for any of them to reach delectable or would buy a second copy because I'm primarily a fiction reader, and I feel like most of my nonfiction interests lean very heavily into trans rights, less so sex positivity, the politics of sex activism, things like that. I am very interested in that, but I think it was okay, very much worth checking out if that's your bag. Incredibly well researched, very well set out, and would definitely recommend to people who already have an interest in that area or are looking to learn more. I feel like it's a good medium level, like it's not too difficult to get into, but there's a lot of interesting material there, even if you're well versed in these topics. Four Treasures of the Sky by, I can't remember who the author is. This was delectable, guys. This was delectable. Jenny Zhang, that's her name. This is one of those books I can't really remember what the book was about, but I loved it so much. This was so close. This was very close to being top tier. I think the ending pissed me off a little bit. This is set in 1800s America following a Chinese immigrant whose parents are arrested due to their political views, and then she's shipped over to America and is then having to survive. You know, I could rank it so high and I would still forget what the story is even about. This was incredibly dark. It discusses a lot of the anti-Chinese sentiment that spread across America during the 1800s, despite exploiting Chinese labor. The description of when the main character is shipped from China to America, oh my god, it is heart-wrenching. It is so visceral. And there was a really beautiful but depressing concept of the main character essentially developing like an alternate version of herself to help cope with the difficulties of her new life in America. Like this kind of protective inner self that came out in the most dangerous parts of her life. The ending was horrific, so depressing and genuinely, I think, kind of spoilt the book. Absolutely delectable. The reason it wasn't the highest tier was because of the ending, unfortunately. Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. That is going to be, would buy a second copy. I love this book. I love Daphne du Maurier. That is no secret. I think I was on like a generational run of depressing books because Jesus Christ, this is a depressing book. It is so endless. It is relentless. It is just, what more could you put your main character through? From my memory of the novel, we start off with the main character, Mary, whose remaining family member has recently just died. So she's sent to live with a distant uncle who lives in Cornwall, I think, in the titular Jamaica Inn. He is a brute, a drunken man who clearly has some very dark backwards deals going on. His patrons at Jamaica Inn are all odd. And what I loved about this book is that Mary falls for the bad guy, and they don't try to justify that decision. She totally falls for the person that you're not supposed to root for. Daphne du Maurier does not shy away from just putting her characters through horrific situations. She is not scared to go dark with her stories. My main critique of this, I remember that there's a vicar character who was like kind of a predictable villain. There were some scenes that were kind of easy to predict, but I don't think it impacted my enjoyment hugely. My first top tier book of the year. The Girls in the Wild Fig Tree. Okay, let me explain myself. As I said, this is a non-fiction book. I don't think this was delectable, but I think it is a very important book. I think it was a very moving book, and I absolutely stand behind everything that the author was saying, because this discusses Kenya and its approach to female genital mutilation, so an incredibly important story to be telling. And Nice Longete, the author, is such an inspiring person. I love the way that she writes. She has such a familiar, pleasant, welcoming voice to listen to, even when she's discussing some really dark and upsetting themes and topics. There's just like an overwhelming feeling of hope and belief in humanity throughout this book. Such a personal story where she talks about how she tackled her village elders' opinions on FGM and how long it took, and the amount of blood, sweat and tears, the work on the ground, how it took multiple people coming back, and how she basically saved herself and other girls from the cut at a very young age. I would really recommend reading this book. Maybe I should move that up to delectable. I find it really difficult to rate nonfiction outside of what it's talking about and the way that it's presented. The Mark by Frida Isberg. I didn't like this book. The Mark is an Icelandic book in a near future dystopia, I suppose, where this sensitivity assessment is rolled out, or is about to be rolled out in the very near future across society, to test how empathetic people are, how likely they are to commit psychopathic acts. Basically, very similar premise-wise to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. I don't think it achieves or is as well written as that book. And we follow a host of different characters from different walks of life who have different opinions, political motivations, fears, anxieties about the sensitivity assessment. I thought this book was quite convoluted. There were a lot of different characters who were not super memorable. Some of them were more memorable than others, but I found it difficult to keep track of everyone, to know what everyone's motivations were, how they overlapped with each other, to the point where I ended up just like not really caring anymore what was going on. I very much tapped out of this book at some point. I still finished it, but I didn't think that it was a very satisfying ending or a satisfying book overall. I honestly think that if like 2 characters were cut from this book, it would be way stronger. It would have better messaging. It would leave with a more climactic ending. I felt it was very anticlimactic, and there were certain perspectives that I cared much more about and found much more engaging than some others. Coraline by The Most Evil Man on the World. I'm indifferent. I'm sure I don't need to explain to people what the plot of Coraline was. This was recommended to me by someone, and I was kind of interested in just checking it out, seeing what the hype was. It was a book that I think I'd always meant to read, and a movie that I always meant to watch, and I don't regret reading it. I didn't have any huge feelings about it. I think I ranked it 4 stars, which is like a very good ranking for me, but it's like when an author has done something so terrible, it is really hard to read objectively. And it just really overshadowed most of my thoughts about this story. I think it was a pretty honest, imaginative depiction of child abuse and neglect. I think that I would have found this much creepier if I read it at the intended age when I was a bit younger, as a 26-year-old. It was just okay, and I ended up being very indifferent. We Do Not Part by Han Kang. I think this was... it was okay. I think if I'd made this video after I'd just read it, I probably would have put it in the delectable tier. But I can't remember what this book was about. I love Han Kang. I would consider her to be one of my favourite authors. Human Acts by her is a beautiful, horrific novel that affected me deeply. So I'm a little sad now that We Do Not Part is kind of just there, like, it was okay. What I can remember from this book is that the main character goes to visit her friend's house deep in the woods to look after her pet bird whilst she's away. This is a highly literary fiction book. It is dense, and a lot of the time I wasn't 100% sure what exactly was going on, but it was still beautifully written, very sad, and I don't think it was something that spoke to me at the point that I read it. I made a note to myself that I just needed to stop taking everything so literally when it came to Han Kang's books, because there's always kind of like an element of supernatural, and you're not sure if this is a metaphor for something or if something literally supernatural is happening in the book. And I think with We Do Not Part, that really stuck with me. I struggled to pass through what was the main character working through her inner thoughts and what was actually happening. And maybe that wasn't the point. You're not really supposed to know, and that's not what you were supposed to take away from it. But I think I was too much of a literal thinker to gain more from this book. The Third Love by Hiromi Kawakami. I'm also going to put this in It Was Okay / good. The concept of this one, I saw the back and I was like, absolutely yes, this sounds exactly my bag. It is about this woman who is stuck in a dissatisfying relationship with someone that she considers to be, I think, a childhood love, and she learns to essentially lucidly dream and live different lives in her dreams, and the book is split up into the different lives that she lives in different time periods. Just absolutely something that I would gobble up. The reason that it is only okay was because the concept was much more interesting than the delivery. And I think with a lot of Kawakami's books, I feel like I'm more in it for the idea than the execution. I felt the same about Strange Weather in Tokyo, but it has been enough also to be put off by the the relationship dynamics that she always writes between women and significantly older men, because it is a significantly older man who has known her since she was a child in school that teaches her how to lucidly dream and live different lives in her dreams. This figure, this man, is always in these different time periods in her dream lives. And it's such an interesting concept, but I don't know why it had to be made romantic. Why can't we just have sweet old men? Give him a sweet old woman with him, please. Like, if you want to give him a romance. Or can we maybe follow like an old woman who wants to... That was just a thought that I could not get out of my head as I was reading The Third Love. I was like, is she going to do the thing again? Well, yeah, she's going to do the thing. Yeah, okay. I'm smiling because I'm still quite fond of this book, and I really think that there is something in there. I do want to give it a reread. Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. Perfect. 10 out of 10. No notes. I cannot believe I took this long to get around to Julia Armfield. She is exactly my type of author. Our Wives Under the Sea is about two women and the slow deterioration of their relationship after one of the women goes on a deep sea exploration as part of her job and is unable to tell her wife what happened and what she saw down there. Her wife starts to change and become unrecognizable to her. I don't want to say anything more than that. It is like beautiful eldritch horror, eldritch down to a T. I loved the intrigue, the mystery. I love that shit. For such a short book, it is quite slow burn. Also very sad. Like, there's an inherent sadness to this book. What I also loved about Our Wives Under the Sea is how accessible the language was. Like, it's a very easy book to just get in and read. Another reason that I would buy a second copy of this book, aside from absolutely loving it, is just fucking, what is that sticker? I'm begging people who design book covers, stop putting the stickers on. Stop it. Put it on the back of the book. Don't put it on the front. Anyway, The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. I'm indifferent about this book. This is a big book. you see this? This is a big boy. The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern used to be one of my favorite books. So I went into this kind of knowing that it was unlikely this would become a favorite too because of how wildly different it was. I knew that this book also kind of deconstructs itself. It's not an easy book to read and that it gets convoluted and difficult. And I like the idea of a challenge, but in reality, I didn't enjoy reading it when it started deconstructing itself. I am going to have to look up what exactly the Starless Sea is about. How do I even explain this book? The main character, whose name I cannot remember, at university, he discovers a book in the library which has a whole bunch of different stories, somewhat abstract. I think one was based on Blackbeard, and amongst those stories, he finds one written about something that happened to him as a kid, word for word. Obviously, it's very confusing, very disorientating, and very scary. So he's like, I gotta figure out how one of my childhood stories ended up being in this random book. And he ends up kind of unraveling a trail of secrets that leads him to this masquerade party where he finds this secret underground library. And there's time travel and I don't know. My difficulty to explain what happens in this book and to remember what exactly happens in this book is probably the same experience that I had actively reading the book. You know what? Fuck it. I actively disliked the Starless Sea. Abstract to the point of convolution is where I find it difficult. Again, I think when something becomes so confusing to me, I end up tapping out and I don't care anymore because I'm disengaged. I think the ending kind of becomes less of a story and becomes more of the emotions and the feelings of a story, and that was just like frustrating to me rather than cool or exciting or groundbreaking. I just was not really along for the ride. Pink-Pilled Women in the Far Right by Lois Shearing. It was good. This is another non-fiction book. This is another book club book. You can probably tell when it comes to anything to do with feminism, sex, that it's going to be a Hannah Witten Patreon book. This is looking into far-right women and how women are indoctrinated into the far-right lifestyle, particularly online. This was super interesting. I think this would have been delectable because something that the author did, which is very dangerous and very admirable, and something that just like unfortunately wasn't as present in the book as it could have been, is that they basically went undercover in one of these far-right forums and did it to actively gather intel and data on how these men indoctrinate women, but also how just in general women operate within the online sphere when they are in the manosphere, when they're making far-right content. I feel like we didn't get enough about this like fake persona that they created to go undercover. That was really interesting, and maybe there'll be a follow-up book where they go more into detail about that, but I feel like it was sparingly peppered throughout the book. I still think this was like a really good dive into the different ways far-right women present themselves online and the reach that they have, how that kind of seeps into content as a whole without us even realizing potentially the origin or the underlying messaging that comes from like stay-at-home mum cooking TikToks, for example. Things that I didn't really consider deeply enough beforehand. So a very good book. I think I just wanted more from the author themselves and their experiences from going undercover. I think it's a shame that wasn't more in the book. Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas. Delectable. I liked this book so much. I borrowed it from the library and I did it for a reading challenge as a book set in Mexico, written by a Mexican author. I gave this a bit more of an in-depth review in my reading challenge video, but the backdrop is the Mexican-American border war in the 1800s. And it is like a dark romance primarily, I'd say, between Nina, who is the daughter of a rancher, and Nestor, who becomes a rancher after a very traumatic event happens when they're both kids, and Nestor believes Nina to be dead. Fast forward like 5 to 10 years, Nina is not dead, and Nestor discovers this. They kind of pin it down to like a wild animal attack. Nope. It's vampires. So dark, like some genuinely creepy, scary depictions of vampires that I was not expecting to be spooked out by. You have a lot of like very compelling characters. I think parts of this story probably leaned a little bit into too many romantic tropes that docked a few stars from me and meant that it was not a book that would be top tier, but I think very fondly of this book and I had a great time reading it. The Husky and His White Cat Season, Volume 8. Delectable. Volume 7 was a story in which a lot is revealed to the characters within the story, and then you get to see their reactions after being privy to that information the entire story. Volume 8 gives you information that you do not know anything about. It gives you that background story to a character, and it reveals so much, explains so much, and is heartbreaking. This was delectable. Shit really kicked off in this volume too. Just so good. Private Rites by Julia Armfield. Would buy a second copy. Are you seeing a trend here? Private Rites follows 3 sisters in this post-apocalyptic or like apocalyptic, maybe apocalyptic world where it doesn't stop raining. The world has flooded, and in response, a lot of people now live in adapted housing to have these stilts to hold the houses above water. And the sister's father is the original architect of this invention. The story follows the sisters as they essentially have to reunite after their father dies in order to deal with the estate, his legacy, his will, whilst the world is kind of going to shit around them, and a lot of the drama that happens between these three sisters. This story draws a lot of influence from King Lear, if that is of any interest to anyone who has not yet read Private Rites. I just love the way that Julia Armfield writes. I love the settings, I love the difficult, complex characters that she writes and how they all interact with each other. I love seeing sister dynamics play out on page, like the youngest, middle, eldest sister, and how they all have to deal with their respective partners, things like that. Is just fabulous. Still, despite this kind of being like an apocalyptic novel, there's still that kind of creeping, slow, eldritch, almost horror that I am come to associate with Julia Armfield's works. And I love it so much. Black Water Sister by Zen Cho. I think I actively disliked Black Water Sister. Again, this was for a reading challenge, so I gave a pretty in-depth review about this. This story is about a Malaysian teen. She's not even a teenager. That was part of the issue that I had with this book. This story follows a young Malaysian woman and her family who move back to Malaysia from America because of debt. The main character, Jess, is a closeted lesbian who is in a long-distance lesbian relationship, who is obviously like now trying to find a job in a new country that she doesn't know very well, and is also trying to cope with the fact that she doesn't think her parents and wider family will be accepting of her. And she starts to hear her dead grandma's voice in her head, except she's not hearing her voice, it is her dead grandma's ghost in her head. There's a lot more to this story. I think the concept was cool. Again, when I picked this up, I ended up not liking it because I don't think it was a very well written book. I think it was a bit juvenile, potentially aimed at readers younger than myself, but then we have a main character who is apparently supposed to be like 22, and she didn't read like she was 22. She didn't think like she was 22. She felt really young, and for the kinds of things and messagings and the way that it was written in terms of like the adult nature of some of the things, it didn't feel like at 26 I should feel too old reading that book. I think it just wasn't very well written. Plot was very slow to start. The blurb kind of gives away the whole grandma ghost thing, so you're kind of waiting for that to kick off and to actually, you know, lead to something. Yeah, this was an active dislike for sure. Marvellous Light by Freya Mask. I'm indifferent to this book. I don't think this is the type of book for me. This is a gay historical magical book where the main character works in like the civil service or something. He ends up accidentally inheriting a job that places him into some importance within like this hidden secret magical society that investigates something. That is all that I remember. He ends up meeting like this rich, annoying other magical gay guy who is in charge of an estate, who has a big family, and there's a mystery there about things. This book was recommended to me, and so I took it in with kind of like, I'm going to read this because I want to give it a chance. This one I kind of could tell as I was getting through it, like, I don't know if this book is for me. I don't think I'm a huge fan of Mask's writing style in general, but I'm going to say that magical fiction, not really my bag. Historical fiction is also not my bag, so the combination of the two probably meant my eyes kind of glaze over a little bit, which is a shame because I think there's like a whole world of imagination out there when it comes to different types of magical systems. Also very interesting. It could be, it just isn't to me. The other notes I made about this book is that I felt like the pacing was kind of all over the place. Ultimately, I never really felt connected to either of the main characters or any of the other characters. I mean, there is a sequel. I think there's 3 books actually, but the direct sequel, which had like a portion in the back of the book, is sapphic, and I think maybe that would be of more interest to me since I have previously enjoyed Sarah Waters' Fingersmith, for example. But even that premise did not get me excited at all for the second book. I just have no interest in continuing this series. Not for me, sadly. Counterattacks at 30 by Won Pyoung-song. Sadly, I'm going to put this in indifferent. I feel like loads of people were on board with the same author's book Almond, and I did enjoy that one. I got this book because I really liked the front cover and I was willing to give more of their writing a go. What is this book about? I'm struggling to remember. I feel like it was someone who is tired of their work life and decides to start taking on like these small acts of rebellion in their workplace that then grow increasingly more powerful and disruptive. This book was definitely supposed to be funny. Like, she meets this man at work who almost prompts her and allies with her, and there was like an element of humor to it. It was a bit nothing-y to me. I think I was like expecting more commentary on the way that office life drains you, the way that it is inherently performative, and the silly things that you have to do to appear to be a good worker, particularly if you work in an office and if your role is undervalued and you've never felt particularly important or extraordinary in your life. I don't feel like it did as much of that as I wanted from it. And it was really bizarre because I feel like I left the book actually feeling kind of deflated about life, which I'm not sure if that was what you're supposed to take from it, but that's what I did take. Okay, I took a little break, but I am back. Milk Fed by Melissa Broder. Ooh, I'm not sure about this one. It was good. It was okay. How do I explain this book? Milk Fed follows a very, very disordered main character, can't remember her name, who has incredibly strict rules around her weight, her eating behaviors, her exercise, and you kind of see her do her day-to-day life and her like rituals, how she feels that this brings her success and like almost social clout in her office. And she goes to this yogurt place, like a frozen yogurt place maybe, I don't know, and the server over the counter is this beautiful fat woman. The main character has like a very strict yogurt order she always follows, and this is a new server, so she's kind of like, oh my god, I have a new server, what if she gets my order wrong, like my calories are going to be way out. And then the server purposefully gets her order wrong and gives her like a full fat, fully fledged frozen yogurt cup. The main character indulges in more ways than just the yogurt. This is a complicated book. Like, look at the front cover. I went in being a freak. I actually found it at the place where I used to live, at the local library. And the thing about libraries in the UK, particularly the ones that are like in smaller towns, is that you'll find a lot of the shelves are just filled with crime, thrillers, and classics, and summer beach reads, right? That is typically what is going to be stocked in library shelves in the fiction section. So when I found this already on the shelf, I was like, what? Because this is the kind of book that I would order in. And I pulled it out because it's like a bright orange color. And I saw the front cover and I was like, whoa. And the blurb very much is like this freaky lesbian situationship where one of them likes to feed the other. It is unhinged, but it did not go the direction that I thought it was. I'm going to say that it was good. Good God, there were so many sex scenes. These have become not pointless, what's the word? They have lost their effect because they are so frequent. I don't feel like they added anything much the more that they happened. This is also an incredibly triggering book at the very beginning. You are right in the brain of a deeply disordered woman, so would not recommend to those who struggle with eating disorders or disordered behaviors around food and exercise and weight in general. I don't feel like this book has anything super revolutionary or even progressive to say about the politics of weight and being fat and the politics of desire, particularly the ending. I think this is the first time I'm going to put a spoiler warning in this video. So whenever this sign pops up, it means I'm talking about a spoiler, so skip if you don't want to be spoiled. But obviously this book follows a lesbian physical relationship, situationship, then a romantic relationship, and a very complex one at that. And at the end, they break up. And it's not something that feels like bittersweet, because you know that they're not right for each other. You can kind of see it coming. But the end has the frozen yogurt server, I wish I remembered their names, has her getting together and marrying a man. Part of the issue surrounding their relationship is that the server is an Orthodox Jewish girl. When the main character goes to meet her family, it's very clear that they don't support her being a lesbian and that they have a different idea of who she should be seeing, and they want her to marry a man. So for the ending to do like basically like a conversion plotline, she is clearly pleasing her family and marrying a man, and I think she had a baby in a stroller. So not even that, she had a baby and a husband. There were times where I genuinely had no clue where the book was going, and I thought it was going to go down a supernatural route because there were hints, and I don't know if I misread it. I had such high hopes, expectations. Perhaps I was forcing them onto this book, but it was okay and interesting enough that I would like to check out the rest of Broder's work, because I've heard that they're fun rides. Love in Exile by Sean Fay. There we go. I am breaking the curse of that nonfiction cannot be top tier. If you've not had the pleasure to read a Sean Fay book before, please go check her out. She also wrote the transgender issue, but Love in Exile is more of a memoir from Sean Fay about love and misogyny and transmisogyny, and kind of much more of a personal story that is so beautifully written, again, so accessible. I found her chapter on addiction to also be hugely illuminating. Her candor in this book is really what sells it. Vanishing World by Sayaka Murata. I'm going to put this in delectable. It's close to being top tier. At first, I was incredibly on board because the concept sounded really similar to her previous short story, A Clean Marriage, which is in Life Ceremony. It felt very familiar to me. The concept is basically trying to explain it, a Sayaka Murata concept. In Vanishing World's world, sexual reproduction is seen as taboo, and the appropriate way to have children, to give birth, is through artificial insemination, because the family structure in this universe is that a wife and a husband are related. They are seen to be related, therefore having sex and giving birth traditionally is seen as incest. So a completely different worldview. Our main character is someone who was conceived through natural reproduction, and this is a fact that she keeps within inside herself for a very long time. She feels like an outcast because of it. The appropriate way in this book to get rid of your sexual urges is to fall in love and date fictional characters. Batshit crazy, but obviously raises a lot of interesting ethical, moral ideas and examines how we operate as a society, how our relationships function. There's also new scientific research looking into cisgender men becoming pregnant. Since, this world operates on artificial insemination anyway, it's the next step. But so some really interesting discussions also of gender when you bring into the fact that if men can conceive and then give birth, cisgender men, what does that mean in terms of traditional gender roles and expectations and labor? All these really interesting thoughts. Again, I think the blurb spoilt this. There's something in the blurb that exposes a part of the storyline that does not happen until the final third of the book. I felt like I was spoiled. I think this was not top tier for me because I had a few issues with the translation. Ginny Tapley Takamori, I feel like the translation was almost watered down. Perhaps this was intentional. Maybe it was the writing rather than the translation. I always find judging translations very difficult because I am monolingual. I cannot sit there, read the original and compare and understand what was the writer's choice versus what was the translator's choice and what the limitations of the English language were. So I had a few tiny minuscule issues. There's also like this random part at the end which is very uncomfortable to read. A lot of people hated that part. Completely understand that. I feel like this is just a Sayaka Murata thing. But overall, I absolutely loved the questions that this had me asking. I will always remember like this one part when one of the cis men who gets pregnant discusses how it's really difficult to find maternity clothing. So he ends up wearing like this loose flowing dress, and there's no commentary around that. It's just that he's wearing a dress because physically it is the easiest thing for him to be wearing when he is heavily pregnant. And then that had me thinking, in this world, is clothing gendered? Because there was like no illusion or no discussion of gendered clothing. Vanishing World, very interesting. The Corset by Laura Purcell? I'm not sure how you pronounce her surname. This is going to go into It Was Okay. I think that I would have enjoyed this more if I'd read it at a different point in my life. This is a dark Victorian novel. Incredibly dark. I knew it was dark. It was recommended to me, and I know that The Silent Companions is also really well loved by people who also like this writer. This story has two female characters. One is Ruth, who is a teenage girl who has recently been imprisoned under trial for murder, and the other girl is Dorothea, who is a very well-off young woman who is kind of disillusioned. The level of social status that lends itself to being disillusioned about how the world operates, and is also like hugely obsessed with phrenology, and as part of a charity case goes to visit Ruth in prison and asks Ruth to tell her story and if she really did murder somebody. Ruth is convinced that she has some supernatural power that means she can curse people with the items of clothing that she stitches. Dorothea, on the other hand, is there trying to prove the fact that the shape of Ruth's skull predisposes her to being a murderer. There's definitely some innate humor to how ridiculous Dorothea's approaches are. This is okay because I read this in April, and the entirety of April was a horrific month for me. I got some really bad news that lasted the entire month, and I feel like I was not able to separate that event from me reading this book. I read it in April. It was beautiful weather in April. I remember going to sit on a park bench in the sun, reading this horrible book. I was literally sat there on the bench, like... It was the kind of book that if you read in public, you feel like it's inherently inappropriate to be reading in public, even if no one is around you or can see what you're reading. One of the most vivid, visceral, traumatic birth scenes I've ever read. The humour and the annoyance from this book came from the direct juxtaposition of Ruth's chapters, where she's having like the most traumatic, horrific retelling of her story, how she ended up in prison, how she became convinced that what she sows ends up killing people. And then you switch to Dorothea, who's like wandering around London, looking at people's skulls. Girl, I don't care about Dorothea right now. I'm in the midst of Ruth's tragic life, and I want to know what the fuck is going on with her. I don't want to hear Dorothea doing something random. It also means that we don't really get much of Ruth's current perspective in prison, being imprisoned, and it just makes it a little difficult to feel connected to her in the moment, and always seeing Ruth from Dorothea's very skewed perspective. And ultimately, I ended the book questioning why Dorothea's character existed at all. Like, I know obviously there had to be a character to meet with Ruth in the prison cell, to hear Ruth's story, to counteract some of the influences outside of the prison cell. I understand structurally there had to be something, but I don't think the amount of importance put on Dorothea's character made this a stronger book. That doesn't mean that I will not check out more of her books. Disability, Intimacy, Essays on Love, Care and Desire. It was okay. This is a collection of essays, thoughts, poetry, put together and edited by the late Alice Wong, and some of it is absolutely beautiful. This was the third book club book from Hannah Witton's Patreon, and probably one of the ones that I was most excited for. I didn't know of Alice Wong before reading this book. I don't think I knew of any of the contributors, so I learnt about a lot of new people, heard from a lot of different perspectives. I resonated hugely with the first section of the book, but in the different chapters that came through, I kind of felt myself becoming more disengaged. I don't know if it was just personal experiences that didn't speak so much to me as the others did, but yeah, this collection for me petered out towards the end, but I very much appreciate the fact that it exists. I think it is worth checking out if you are passionate about disability and sensuality and sexuality within disability and the different ways of caring and showing up for disabled people. Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, Manhwa Volume 7, would buy a second copy. I really love the arc of this volume. That is the only reason why it's top tier rather than delectable. The arc is one of my favorites, to the point that I wasn't even mad about the action scenes and how convoluted some of them might have been. I don't think that the action scenes were too confusing or heavy in this volume, so that might be why it is a higher tier and I wasn't confused. This one is one of the flashback scenes. You get to see the main characters when they're a bit younger, and there's like a particular scene that I just love. It makes my heart soar. Yeah, my only comment about this volume, and I'm going to say with every danmei or manhwa released by Seven Seas Entertainment, I just wish the volumes were longer. Make them longer. Release less volumes at the same price. Just fucking make them longer, Seven Seas. City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. Oh, wrong one. Actively disliked. I have a whole video about this book. This is a book set in Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunters series, in which there are half angel, half human demon hunters. The main character, Clary Frey, is thrown violently into this world when her mother is kidnapped, and she realizes actually that she is half angel, half human too. It's an urban fantasy romance from the mid-2000s, and I reread it as part of the challenge, and I gave it 2 stars. I'm just not the right age range for this. I loved it when I was younger and when I read different types of books, and I'm not into these types of books anymore. That's basically it. I wouldn't say it's so bad that I would put it in the bin. That's possibly just for the nostalgia factor, to be so real. More Than This by Patrick Ness. This is the definition of indifference. This is a very long book. Patrick Ness writes a lot about mental health and youth's mental health in a way that is very important to people who are younger than me. I think if I'd read this 10 years prior, it would have meant a lot more to me and I would have resonated with it a lot more. This book is about a British teenager who has moved a few years ago to America with his younger brother and mum. It kind of opens the book with him deciding to jump off a cliff and end his life. Except he wakes up afterwards, and he wakes up in his childhood English village, except it is empty, apocalyptic levels of empty. He travels through the world, he tries to find food, he finds a few other people, some of them good, some of them very bad. It was very interesting as a setup, but I found it really disappointing because I could not ignore the repetition of Patrick Ness's writing, unfortunately. I've met Patrick Ness, absolutely lovely guy. He also stands up hugely for the trans community. I think he is a brilliant guy. I just wonder if More Than This was a book that I should have read when I was younger. A lot of repetitive writing techniques used that became very difficult to ignore and actively annoyed me and frustrated me at times. And there's a lot of action in this book, and I don't find Nessa's action writing to be particularly engaging. Very much indifferent. I think this would have been an important book for a lot of people, not for me. Salt Slow by Julia Armfield. Would buy a second copy, baby. This is possibly the first and maybe even only collection of short stories that I have thought was almost amazing all the way through. I think there was one short story that I was a little less fond of than others, but aside from that, whoa. This is the third Julia Armfield book that I read in 2025. I was already very much sold on her writing. The best way to explain Salt Slow is a collection of short horror stories. If you've read any of Julia Armfield's other books, you're probably going to enjoy Salt Slow. Graveyard Shift by ML Rio. Indifferent. It's so funny, because if you go back to my horror books subscription video, I said that I thought this was a great little novella, and I was surprised to hear that a lot of people didn't really like it. I'm indifferent to it now. Graveyard Shift is about 4 or 5 different characters who are all related in some way, shape, or form, and then meet in their college campus's graveyard. And there's like rats, and I can't really remember. It's like some kind of mystery with some interesting different archetypal tropes of people, but that is supposed to be the point, influenced by Scooby-Doo. For a novella that you didn't love, when it's less than 100 pages, I find it kind of difficult to remember exactly what happened, because you spend such a short amount of time with it that it doesn't sometimes always make a lasting impression. Beware the Woman by Megan Abbott. It was okay. I really thought potentially delectable, but, I looked at the rest of the books that I put in delectable, and I was like, I don't think that's delectable. This was one of the books that I thought was, so heavily influenced by Rebecca, but I wasn't even mad about it. This is one of those cabin horror books. Our main character is recently pregnant and goes to visit her family-in-law in, this very remote, woodsy area in America. And, her in-laws start to get increasingly protective and strange, and it's one of those, a slow burn mystery. I need to get out of this house, but everyone's telling me I'm crazy. I wanted it to be weirder, and also I don't think there was anything in this story that necessarily shocked me. There were twists that I was not expecting, but I wasn't shocked by them. That is probably why it is not delectable. The Redemption of Morgan Bright by Chris Panettiere. Still never learned to pronounce his surname. It was okay. It was good. So much of my opinion about this book is formed by my experience when I first read it, in which I was just so heavily spoilt by the blurb. This story is about a young woman whose sister was recently found dead after escaping from an asylum. A year later, she decides to go undercover and do some investigative journalism, and she kind of adopts this different personality, this traditional housewife who's gone a little bit crazy, to get in and learn from the inside what happened to her sister. If we're saying that this is all that the book is about, this is where the blurb should have stopped. The blurb told me too much, and it influenced my reading of this book, and is why I just don't think it can be delectable. I think Chris Panettiere is a very clever, talented writer. There's a little bit of an issue where, perhaps retrospectively, some themes, overarching messaging there was an attempt to slot this in to a pre-existing story that wasn't necessarily heading in that direction, and it ended up feeling a bit like 2 stories that were originally separate and weren't blended particularly well. Maybe I personally wasn't picking up enough on the undertones before that reveal, but I've read a lot of other reviews too where people also felt that it was kind of ham-fisted in afterwards. This was not delectable. My battery is about to run out. I'll see you on another day. Hello, it is the next day. I'm ready to tackle the rest of my tier list. The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation Comic Volume 8. Again, comfort series. Makes total sense. In my notes, I literally wrote, yippee! Because it is one of the arcs in which their relationship further develops. The thing about this story is there are so many extensive, long flashbacks told through dreams sometimes as well, that it can take quite a few volumes to see their relationship develop as their current selves. And that's not really a complaint. I've just noticed that my Smisky light is just this green glow. So yes, top tier for me. The Haunted Moustache by David Bramwell. This was delectable. This one was such a surprise to me. I picked it up at a clearance sale, and it was maybe like £2, and it's a pretty beautiful hardback, like a very solid looking book. And one of my favorite things about this book is the formatting and the use of images and typography. It was like a very readable book. There's a lot of newspaper clippings and photographs, just like a gorgeous way of setting out a book. And this story is about David Bramwell, who is a UK comedian, does a lot of stand-up. It follows this kind of, I assume to be semi-autobiographical, because it is just very bizarre and strange, of his great-grandfather's mustache or something. Like, he has a framed mustache. And it's a story about how he goes and tries to find out more about his heritage, whilst also kind of relaying his story of growing up and doing a lot of stand-up comedy in Brighton and Brighton nightlife, and some of the bizarre and strange things that happened. Not sure how much this leans into fantasy, but it was a very enjoyable read nonetheless, and such a surprise. I really did not expect to love this book as much as I did. Another peek. This is a fanzine, and there is a story behind this one. This was created by the Twitter user Soft and Worm, and it is a collection of fan art short stories from a range of different artists based on MXTX's The Scum Villains Self-Saving System, which is already kind of like a batshit insane story. So to have like these fan-made stories are so funny, so sweet, beautiful art. My copy was actually lost in the mail. It was misdelivered, and Royal Mail could not deliver it to me, so I got in touch with the artist and I was like, I'm so sorry, it's gone. I don't know if this scene is out of production. Is there any way I could get a copy? And they really lovely sent me another copy, despite the fact that it was not their fault. This fanzine holds a very special place in my heart. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. No one's going to be surprised. It's top tier. It's always been top tier. I think it will always be top tier. I feel like The Song of Achilles is one of those books that is so widely accessible to so many different types of people. It is a great book to get back into reading or to get into reading. For me, it feels like the mythological retelling story alongside the same author's Circe. The Song of Achilles kind of explores the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus, and is somewhat loosely based on the Iliad. It is just so gorgeous. It is gorgeous. You get to see their friendship and relationship develop over the years. Beautiful character development. It's such lush writing. I don't think there's a huge amount more I can say about why The Song of Achilles will be my favourite book. Lapvona by Atessa Moshfegh. I'm actually going to put this in the actively disliked category, and there is a reason for this. This featured in my unrecommendable books video. I went into a bit more depth about what this story is. Lapvona is the name of the fictional village that Moshfegh has created, and it is a medieval fiefdom, which is riddled with corruption, pillagers, thieves, and also things like man-made plagues from the wealthy feudal lord who lives above them, literally on a tall hill with a castle above. The main character is Marek, who is the teenage son of the local shepherd, and he is viciously abused by multiple different people, and he essentially ends up committing somewhat of an accidental crime. It's debatable whether or not it's accidental, and gets sent to live with the feudal lord in the castle because the lord finds him entertaining. There you get to see kind of the further corruption of the wealthy, kind of this idea that corruption seeps through everything, and how much of that corruption stems from the top and trickles down. This is just such an inherently disturbing, disgusting book. I was considering putting this into the indifferent category, but I do think that I actively disliked it. I wasn't a huge fan of her writing style, and it is the first Moshfegh book I've read. I just don't think I liked it. I got kind of tired of it by the end. I thought it dragged, and it is one of those books that I feel I finished for the sake of finishing it rather than enjoying it or wanting to finish it. Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice. It pains me to put this in the indifferent category, but I have to separate the great TV show from the original book, which is such a slog, guys. It is such a slog. Anne Rice does not write for the masses. This is a long, tiring book. Interview with a Vampire is a story of an interviewer who interviews a vampire as he recounts his stories as the owner of a plantation, which is something that they change for the TV show, and how he came to be a vampire. The thing about this book is that the structure is so dense. It is in interview format, but more in the sense of you hear a little bit about the interviewer. The interviewer isn't even named. Daniel Malloy is not named as Daniel Malloy in the first book. You don't have any real clue who this guy is. And mostly you're hearing Louis talk at Daniel. And so it's just big chunks of text where you know it's a speech, and you've got some speech within speech, but it's such a slog. That's all I can say about this book. The characters that I've come to know through the TV show are beloved to me, and it is just interesting to see where they actually originated from and what their conception was. There is just something there that is entertaining enough for me to feel indifferent about it rather than disliking it. Reckless, or The Petrified Flesh by Cornelia Funke. It was okay. It was okay. Again, I have a video on this going into more depth, but this is set in kind of like a fairy fantasy world where a lot of fairy tales are dark and twisted and exist through a parallel universe that the main character, Jacob Reckless, traverses through. He spends most of his childhood life kind of abandoning his sickly mother and his younger brother to become a petty thief. And there are these creatures called the Goyle with skin made of stone, different types of stone, and his younger brother ends up getting infected and is slowly turning into one of these creatures. So the story is trying to follow Jacob as he attempts to find a cure for his brother. I think it is a great setup, such an intriguing world that I feel was limited by the fact that this is a children's book. It's not even a young adult book, it's a children's book, even though parts of this are terrifying. I think this was just, held back so much by the age range, and it could have been further developed. I have not read the second and third books. I don't think I ever will. The Discomfort of Evening by Lucas Reineveld. Hey guys, it's our first Get in the Bin. I'm actually surprised we got this far. How many books? It is book number 40. That was the first book last year that made me think, nope, get away from me. This book has beautiful prose, gorgeous setting, writing, very vivid. The story is just too dark. The contents of the story are horrific. Our 10-year-old protagonist, Jazz, lives in like a heavily reformist family in the Dutch countryside. They run a farm. The book opens up with Jazz's older brother drowning in the local lake, and we follow the family afterwards and witness how this impacts them and how it kind of further emboldens the family to abuse Jazz, essentially. It is not pleasant. It is clearly a commentary on grief and religion. I'm so glad that I got this book from the library and I didn't buy it for myself. Reineveld is a very talented writer, but this book is not it. And I hated almost every moment of reading it past like the second chapter. Some People Need Killing by Patricia Evangelista. It was good. This is a investigative journalist's story of a Filipino leader who incited vigilante gang killings of a lot of very regular citizens in the Philippines. Anyone who had any ties whatsoever to drugs were brutally murdered. This is a very in-depth, dark exploration of Rodrigo Duterte's reign. I learned a lot from this book, but it is structured quite densely, and the way that they're structured, these interviews and the different people that she interviews, means that sometimes they can get quite muddled. It's not a very chronological recollection of Duterte, so it is a little difficult as a beginner to this part of history and this part of the world, but I do think it is a good read. One of these non-fiction books that I feel quite detached from, despite being interested in the topics and learning more about parts of history that I was never even made aware of. All That's Left Unsaid by Tracy Lien. This, I'm indifferent. In this book, the main character is, I believe this is set in the 80s or 90s in a Vietnamese community living in an Australian town. Her younger brother is brutally murdered in a local Vietnamese restaurant with a bunch of witnesses who refuse to speak up about what actually happened. So it's kind of this murder mystery where the sister is determined to find out how her younger brother was murdered and why exactly no one else is giving the police any information. I am indifferent to this because I don't think murder mysteries are my kind of thing. I also don't think this was anything too special. Like, it was pretty easy to read, not in terms of content necessarily, but the writing style was quite accessible. I just don't feel like it sparked any interest for me. The twist, so to speak, I don't think it was a huge twist. I think it was pretty easy to see why none of the witnesses were talking from the very beginning if you just kind of use and apply some common sense. And there's also an attempt to switch character perspectives, and I don't think it really worked. We kind of hear and see from each witness's perspective as we find out who they are, and I think some of those chapters went on for a little bit too long. Like, my interest stayed more with the main character than it did with any of the witnesses to try and understand their motivations, their excuses. I don't know, it was a bit nothingy to me. Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare. It was good. It was good. As much as I hated to admit it, it was good. This is another one of Cassandra Clare's books set in the Shadowhunters universe, except it functions as a bit of a prequel from the Mortal Instruments series, Sea of Bones, in the sense that it is set in the 1800s Victorian period. And I just think this setting is much more suitable, much more engaging for this type of story of demon hunters. And there are definitely some issues that I had with pacing, with characterization, with actual setting writing and the methods used, and it was just a bit flat at times, but the story itself is interesting, engaging, took me on a ride, and I had fun reading it. The Husky and His White Cat Season, Volume 9. I need to remind myself of what happened in this volume. Give me a sec. I'm going to put this in delectable, and I'm going to say the majority, again, of my issues is the length of the volumes and where the publishers decided to cut off the story. It means that getting back into this story after months of waiting for the next volume to be published, and also where the stories end, are so dissatisfying and feel so unfinished, even though the book is literally finished. That is frustrating. This actual part of the story was great. We get to see the background of a character who I did not expect to be expanded upon in such depth. I think this was like truly a heartbreaking volume, though. I did not feel good after finishing it. Night Side of the River by Jeanette Winterson. I'm actually going to say that I am indifferent about this book. This is a collection of short stories. This is not the first Jeanette Winterson book I've ever read. I cannot remember the name of the first one that I read when I was like a teenager. It was not Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, because I do want to go and read that, but I'm not sure if I'm actually a fan of Winterson's writing, to be honest, as the second book is just meh. This is a short story collection, and I have issues with some collections where some stories are always going to outshine the others, and you're always going to end up reading one that is not as impactful or interesting or good as the others. This is a collection of ghost stories, so I think I was expecting to be a bit more freaked out, or I don't know exactly what vibe I was expecting, to be honest, because there are so many different ways that you could write ghost stories. But I can't really remember any of the stories. Some of them felt quite goofy. Like I don't think I was scared. Yeah, I'm interested in more of Winterson's books, but this collection didn't really do it for me overall. You Bury Me by Alam. This was good. It was good. I'm not going to say it was delectable. I talked about this more in my Storygraph Reads the World video, but this is a very short play set in Egypt and kind of follows these, I think, 5 or 6 young adults navigating their life with their different relationships, some queer aspects to it. I think it was interesting. I think I would prefer to have seen it performed, and that's kind of why it was good rather than delectable. It's short. I'm not much of a play reader, and I think a lot of the nuances were probably lost on me in terms of stage directions and actually seeing it play out. Rubens, indifferent. To give some context, this is an art book about the art of Rubens, and I picked it up because I needed a book set in Belgium, and I could not find any ones from my local library. This was the only one that I could find, and kind of fits the criteria. This is just like such a technical art book. It's a biography of Rubens essentially, but also discusses in quite technical terms the types of art that he did, and I am not an art history person, so I'm sure the book was great. I read it. It was okay. Went over my head. Land of Milk and Honey by Si Pam Zhang. That is a top tier book. Land of Milk and Honey is set in a world where like this apocalyptic fog or smog has covered most of the world and means that a lot of food crops cannot be grown. And our main character is a young chef who has worked across many different restaurants and countries, gets an invite essentially to this elite mountaintop retreat that has spices, herbs, meat, vegetables, all of these crops that are very low in resource or completely destroyed across the rest of the world. She ultimately agrees to take this invitation, but she ends up having to cook for this global elite. She is working for a family, and she isn't 100% sure what exactly the family that she is working for, what their motivations are. So, interesting premise, very interesting setup. This book is written so beautifully sumptuous. It is like, I love the way that food writing is done in this. I love the way that setting, environment, relationship writing is done. I think she is such a talented author. I don't know if it will be for everyone, but for me, this hit the mark completely. And I think this actually ended up being another book that I randomly picked up on sale, but oh my god, it is great, and I'm really excited to see what else she releases in the future. I will be checking in. Consumed by Aja Baba. This is another top tier book. I requested this for a birthday or Christmas. If you follow her on Instagram, you'll see the kind of sustainable fashion activism that she does. She is amazing. She is really accessible. I love the way that she writes and sets out her arguments, and also provides a lot of well-researched statistics, facts. But essentially this book is on consumerism and climate change, capitalism, and fast fashion in particular. And I thought I knew a lot about fast fashion, but this book was even more educational to someone who was already interested in the topic, so I can only sing my praises of this book so much before I just need to go and buy copies for people close to me. Lemon by Kwon Yosun. This was okay. I think I ended up giving it like a 4-star. This is such a tiny book, maybe probably even a novella. It is a crime mystery. How do I define this book? It is a very short account of a girl who is murdered, and 17 years on, you are from the perspective of her younger sister, who is still grieving, but it explores how grief takes on different forms, particularly a long time in the aftermath of a murder, and it also kind of focuses in on the prime suspects of the case. And yeah, this is the kind of book that you just need to go and read. It is not worth trying to explain the plot when it is so short and is just so easy to get through. This was so accessible, but I'm going to say that it was only good for the sense of it hasn't stuck with me. I don't remember a huge amount. I think there were a few elements that I found interesting to consider long term. Actually, I am going to give a spoiler. There is the discussion of how the younger sister has got plastic surgery over the years to look more and more like her older sister who has been murdered. And that is just like really interesting. What an interesting exploration. And what a saddening depiction and exploration of grief. I don't think I've come across that theme before, the idea of changing yourself to become more of someone, but maybe perhaps the idea of changing yourself to become more like someone that you miss or that you're grieving, but definitely not physically doing that through plastic surgery. I don't think I've read that before, so that was a really cool aspect to this book. But yeah, it's so short that I feel like it didn't have a huge impact on me. Half Bad by Sally Green. This was good. I have a whole video on this one as well, but Half Bad is set in a world where witches live alongside humans. It's a very clear allegory to race in that you have white witches and black witches, and the main character is the son of the most infamous evil black witch to live, and his mother is a white witch, so he is what they call a half-code. It's a young adult dark fantasy, I would say. I think it was only good because the language was somewhat limited. I think the structure was interesting, but it did mean that the pacing was often sacrificed. I don't know, I just remember the ending of this book being whack. Like, it stopped way too early in the plot than I expected to, and it felt somewhat unfinished, even though this is a series of 2 other books. So I'm not really sure why the decision was made to finish the book at that point. It's just a shame because I think a lot of it is great conceptually, even if it is a little heavy-handed with the themes that it's tackling in terms of racism. But for a young adult dark fantasy, it was okay. Every Day by David Levithan. I actively disliked this one. I don't think it is levels of Get in the Bin, but this was part of my rereading challenge. It was one of my favourite books when I was younger, and I think that is from the influence of the John Greenification of David Levithan. He co-wrote a book with John Green, and that was probably how he ended up on my radar. But I think I had like every David Levithan book when I was a child. The concept of this book is you follow a spirit or a ghost, or we don't really know what they are, but they are someone called A who inhabits the body of a different person every single day. The basic premise is that when in the body of a boyfriend of a girl, A ends up falling in love with a girl and tries to kind of defy the rules of their existence by trying to stick around this girl. Conceptually, very cool. Execution, just so mid. So incredibly mid. I said this before in my review, I feel like David Levithan used the character of A, who is very much like a nothing character, to be a vessel of all the opinions and life lessons that Levithan wanted to tell his young audience at the time. And it just makes for quite a boring, preachy story with some really bizarre chapters thrown in there with, you know, when A wakes up in this in the body of a very fat young guy, and essentially is like, I'm so fucking glad that I never have to be fat again, because this was shit. This was worse than when I was an underage cleaner, essentially fucking free labor slave. Like, and also like a weird chapter on when they wake up in the body of a trans person, and Leviathan doesn't really approach the politics of being in a trans body very well, even though it was kind of like half accepting. It didn't age very well. I don't really want to like judge this from a perspective in which there is more wider knowledge and respect in how to approach and write about trans people, but yeah, it aged badly. So there's an amalgamation of reasons why I disliked this book. How Much of These Hills is Gold by C. Pam Zhang. I'm actually going to say that this was good. It was not delectable because it was not really my style of story, even if I love her writing. It follows two children of immigrants whose parents die very quickly overnight, and they have to learn how to fend for themselves in the incredibly racist South in the 1800s, I believe. It is a heartbreaking and rough depiction of family and grief, and depending on the kindness of strangers, but also being at the mercy of dangerous, destructive people. This is ultimately a very sad book, but the setting of it was just not something that I'm super interested in. So overall, I'm going to say confidently that it was a great book. It was written very well, but it wasn't to my tastes. Braised Pork by Anne Yu. Girls, I'm so indifferent about this book. I don't even remember what happened in this book. This was a library read and very much picked up because I would always be searching for Banana Yoshimoto books in my bookstores, and Anne Yu would always be there, but I just ended up being very disappointed. It was very reflective literary fiction about this wife whose husband has recently died in the bath, and her husband has left like a piece of paper with this drawing of this strange creature, and she kind of goes on a little bit of an adventure to try and find out what this creature is to her husband, what it meant, and also like the wider meaning of what her life is at that time and was with her husband. I didn't have any huge emotions or revelations from reading this book. Maybe I was like not really the correct audience. I've never been a woman trapped in a boring relationship with a husband. It was very dreamlike, very abstract, and I don't necessarily always dislike that, but for me, I didn't get much from this book personally. Lost in the Garden by Adam S. Leslie. I hated this book. I had a few recommendations about this book from a few different people. I'd had my eye on it, but oh my god, this is like such a fever dream of a book, and that is not in a positive way. It was boring and drawn out, long and repetitive. There's a way to write confusing, dreamlike stories, particularly when things are kind of unraveling, and this was not the way to do it. This was such a disengaging way to write it, in my opinion. This is like an old wives' tale, basically, about this town called Almonby. You're not supposed to go to Almonby, and the world has recently turned to shit, almost like a zombie apocalypse, where people are coming back to life after they've died, but they're coming back to life very much in zombie form. And we follow three women who, through various different reasons, decide to go to Almonby, this town that they're always told you cannot go to Almonby, whatever you do not go to Almonby. It's kind of this mysterious folk horror that unravels once they reach Almonby, but also the things that happen on their way when traveling to Almonby. The thing is, this is filled with unlikable characters, so many unlikable characters, and when you're stuck in this repetitive horror with people who you don't give a fuck about, it is not a pleasant, fun read. It is a boring read. It is a read that I just wanted to be over. I think it's like a solid 350 pages or something, and by page 200 I was like, I'm getting kind of bored of this. I don't know if I want this anymore. And by page 300 I was like actively frustrated and pissed off that I was still reading this book and that it was still going. So not bad enough to be getting in the bin, but the way that it was packaged up and the fact that it just didn't know when to stop meant that it just was not good. Feeding the Monster by Anna Bogotskaya. This was another one that I actively disliked, and I'm really sad about this one because it looks really nice on a bookshelf and it was a gift, and it is like a non-fiction exploring different themes in horror and why horror appeals to us, but I think this was such an amateur exploration of horror media. A lot of it was very surface level and kind of scraping together different bits of arguments and different plot overviews of movies and books, and it was just not what I wanted it to be, and it was not good. What this will end up being is a good reference list of different movies, TV shows, books to engage in when I'm looking for something new in the horror theme, but a lot of this is kind of rehashing older arguments, things that all of us, if you're a horror fan, already know. So perhaps to someone who is less seasoned in horror and wants to get into horror, this might be a better read. But even then, I don't think it is hugely critical or analytical, and I don't think it brings anything new to the scene, unfortunately. Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. This was top tier. This was in my horror subscription box and blown away. And I actually, where is it? I have Sundial by her on my TBR. That they brought another one in the next horror box, and I'm so happy that they brought her back, because Looking Glass Sound is one of the most unique individual books that I've read, not only in 2025, but ever. I did not know where this book was going to go. This was one of those books that I argued had such a spoilery blurb that I wish I hadn't read it beforehand, to the point where I'm just not going to read Sundial's blurb in case it's a similar twisty, multi-layered book. I'm so glad that I discovered Catriona Ward. I think she's even coming out with a new book in 2026, so I will be looking into that. Looking Glass Sound is a very layered book where the main character is in this fishing village in somewhere in America, I can't remember where, and he is writing his life's work, his novel, which is set in this fishing village and features kind of the local serial killer figure, Daggerman. That's all I'm going to say. If there's anything more, is very spoilery, but he reunites with some childhood friends that he knew at the same fishing village, and things happen, and that's all you really need to know. You will not know where this book is going to take you. So if that sounds interesting to you, please check her out. She is a great writer. The Haunting of Alejandra by V. Castro. I'm really sorry, and I'm so sad to do this, but I think this book has to go in the bin. I fully stand by this author's political opinions. I think she sounds like an amazing woman. Love the representation that is in this book. However, I think it was written really badly. The Haunting of Alejandra builds upon the Mexican folklore demon La Llorona, and this concept excited me because I'd never read anything featuring La Llorona. She was just kind of like this folklore demon that I knew somewhat about, but very tangentially. Is that how you say that word? Tangentially? This sadly just did not deliver on its premise. I did not enjoy the way that this was written. I think the characterization was incredibly weak and stereotypical. I think a lot of the messaging that the author wanted to deliver, it was so heavy-handed and ended up just feeling like, again, stereotypical, so overdone and not very skillfully delivered. I did want to like this book more, but I think it was bad. I think it was just plain bad. I also wasn't scared or spooked out by any of the content, really. It felt super flat to me. I think one of the book's merits is mainly parts of the book that are set back in the 1500s, 1600s, kind of shows perhaps the origins or beginnings of La Llorona, and that was better than the rest. Sadly not enough to get this out of the bottom tier. When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. Top tier. Would buy a second copy. I was also very surprised by this book, completely blown away. I'd never really heard of Nat Cassidy before. I think I'd heard some people talk about Nestlings. So yeah, he was someone that I vaguely knew of, but was not familiar with his writing or what to expect. And this arrived in my horror subscription box. And oh my God, I did not know how good this book was going to be. I saw some crazy innovative printing method used in this book that genuinely had me like putting the book down thinking, what? You can do that? I did not know that wasn't a thing you could do. Something really simple but so effective. When the Wolf Comes Home tells the story of Jess and this young boy who she rescues when she finds him kind of cowering in the bushes outside of her apartment, and shortly after she rescues him, a creature appears outside of her apartment and wreaks havoc, and she ends up going on the run with this little boy. So many things happen after that which are complete spoilers, and you just need to reach the midsection of this book to feel the absolute joy and horror and terror that Nat Cassidy has created. It is so humorous and also really deeply emotional at times. Just such an amazing book, but very viscerally gory and dark. So if that's not your bag, probably don't check this book out. My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyen Khan Braithwaite. I actively disliked this book. I was so excited for this book. I really wanted more from it. I think the title is so eye-catching and the concept pretty much says what it is on the can. The main character has a sister who is a serial killer. She ends up murdering like all of the men that she sleeps with or is engaged with romantically. And when her sister falls for her work crush, the main character is like, right, I've got to try and stop my sister at any cost at this point. I don't think this was well written. I think it's a very short book, but the pacing is kind of a bit messed up, and I didn't connect with any of the characters really. It just felt very empty, kind of a little soulless. And I thought perhaps there was going to be a bit more humor in it, just because the premise sounds like you're setting yourself up for a dark comedy, but it wasn't really funny. So maybe this was me coming in with the wrong expectations. These are probably like the shortest chapters I've ever seen in a book too, so I don't think that helped make me feel engaged or along for the ride or really deeply knowledgeable or caring about these characters. The next 3 books are MADK Volumes 1 to 3 by Ryo Suzuri, and I'm going to put all 3 of these volumes in Delectable. So I read all 3 of these pretty quickly. The first 2 were rereads, and I'd had volume 3 for a pretty long time, and during October when I only read horror books, I decided, you know what, let's reread the first 2, get to volume 3 and just get it done. I'm so curious about how this story ends. Our main character in this story, Makoto, is someone who is interested and kind of has this socially unacceptable fetish kink where he is into cannibalism. And because he feels like such a freak that no one could ever accept him and there is no physically possible way for this to be done, he summons a demon and says that he will do anything in order to be able to do that. And the demon grants him that wish with the knowledge that the price will be his life. The main character Makoto agrees, carries out the act, and is then killed, only to then be reincarnated as a demon in the underworld. And the rest of the story in the next 2 volumes explore Makoto's new life as this very weak underling in the demon underworld. But what's interesting and fun about this story is Makoto very quickly acclimates, adjusts to becoming a demon, and is like, I am going to be the top demon as soon as possible. I'm going to beat everyone and I'm going to get my revenge. The character designs are so unique. There is a lot of dark humor to be found in this story, and I think my main critique of this will always be that because the art style is so intricate and swirly, there's a lot of times where it's kind of difficult to tell what exactly is going on, and some of that also might be down to trying to censor some of the scenes and probably intentionally being a bit obscure in the sense of trying to understand where some person's legs are or the surrounding world, what exactly is going on. I think it only minimally detracts from the enjoyment. Just like such a wild, dark ride that has a very interesting ending that I remember feeling like kind of disappointed by, but very understanding of why it had to end that way. The Invisible Hotel by Yeji Y. Ham. I am indifferent to The Invisible Hotel. Hello, I paused myself here because hilariously I just did not talk about The Invisible Hotel at all. I think I paused filming and assumed that I had talked about it when I did not at all. If you would like to hear me talk about The Invisible Hotel, I did have a whole segment dedicated to it in my Only Reading Horror Books in October reading vlog, so feel free to go watch that one instead because I failed on this one. A Modern Proposal by Jonathan Swift. I mean, this is delectable. This is such a classic. I found this through watching one of those like iceberg exploration videos where it was going through like the darkest, most disturbing fiction ever written when I was doing some research for my unrecommendable books video. It's dark, but it's not untenably dark. And that is because it is a piece of very well-known satirical fiction. This is just such a fun, ridiculous read, and I think it has aged so well. This is on Project Gutenberg. It's free to just go and read. I'd recommend go reading it. It's super short and incredibly tongue-in-cheek. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Guys, come on, you should know me at this point. This would buy a second copy. I'm not going to explain what the plot of Rebecca is. It's Rebecca, and I have a video talking through Rebecca and how amazing it was to reread it after a long time. I truly believe that Daphne du Maurier was just such a talented, amazing writer who was not scared to go into dark gothic fiction with something to say. It is not going to be for everyone. At the same time though, it is pretty long and a lot of people would probably agree that it is very introspective and drawn out, but I think it's definitely worth that everyone gives this one a try if they've never got to it before. The Midnight Timetable by Bora Chung was delectable. Getting in there, girl. I talked about this relatively recently, but the Midnight Timetable is a collection of short ghost stories centering around this haunted research facility that takes in items that are haunted and preserves them, takes care of them. And we follow an unnamed protagonist who works at this research facility as she learns about different objects within the facility, but also hears all these different stories from her co-workers. Orchang is very easy to read. Her language is very simplistic, and I think that adds to the horror of what she's writing about sometimes. These are not necessarily super scary ghost stories, but I don't think they were set out to be terrifying. I saw Borchang talk about this book in person, and it was very illuminating. She's very humorous. She's very driven by the bizarre, and I also loved the way that through this book, having different items and different storytellers expanded past the feeling of having like this one central protagonist. It was strangely quite a heartwarming, hopeful book. The Flight of the Falcon, another Daphne du Maurier book. I think this one is going to have to go into good. Oh, no, not indifferent. Good. It was good. It is not delectable, I think, purely for the length of the book and how it is a little bit drawn out. The Flight of the Falcon is honestly a very bizarre book. It's kind of difficult to explain what happens because the premise is so unique. It revolves around the character whose name I cannot remember. He is a tour guide showing around different cities in Italy, and something calls him back to his hometown, a fictional town called Rafano, where he has a pretty haunted past due to the war and difficult family relationships. And he goes back to become a temporary librarian at the local university. And he gets to learn a bunch of different people, and he kind of reconnects with different parts of his past whilst retelling like this story of the Falcon, right, and the Flight of the Falcon. And it is bizarre. It's a book that you just kind of have to go into somewhat blind and trust Daphne du Maurier to expand upon the main themes. This is a very character-driven story. I think that might be why it is not delectable, is that there could be a little bit more plot that was a teeny bit more engaging for me, but I still think this is a great book and just a little bit more of a harder one to get into and to perhaps convince others to read. And despite all my criticisms of the book, the ending is incredibly satisfying, incredibly cyclical, in a way that really calls into question legacy, childhood, the importance of being known. So yeah, an interesting one, a difficult one to rank, I'd say. Out There Screaming, an anthology of black horror. I'm gonna have to put this one into indifferent. I've said this before, I will always say this, rating anthologies or short story collections across different authors is something that I find very difficult to do because you have such a breadth of talent, and particularly with horror, which contains so many different subgenres, it's difficult to get everything correct. I think this was a somewhat of a disappointing collection, but there was some great stories throughout here and definitely some authors that I'm interested in checking out more of their work, so I can't say that it was bad, but I also can't say that I loved it or that it was great. And I will always be appreciative of the fact that there is someone out there and there are publishers out there who want to publish this type of work, who are invested in hearing black voices, particularly in kind of more undersubscribed genres like horror. I want more horror. I'm always going to want more horror in the world of literature and film, not in the world. We have enough horrors in the world right now. Madness of the Elder Vampire by Darby Vernon. After sitting with it a while, I'm gonna have to say that I did, unfortunately, actively dislike this one, and I feel bad about this, but at the same time, not really, because the reason I feel somewhat bad is it is an ARC. I did receive it for an honest review, and that's the reason that I don't feel bad about it, is that it's an honest review, and my honest review is that I don't think this was a very good book. I don't think it was amazingly well written. I was actually kind of confused a lot of the times about exactly what was happening or what timeline we were following, but this is a dark fantasy novel about vampires. The interesting aspect to this is that Vernon has set out different types of vampire hierarchies in which you have elder vampires who basically get too old to the point where they go mad. Like they are inflicted with a type of madness specific to old vampires, and at that point they are supposed to be killed because they go crazy and overpowerful and lose their minds. So you have like an interesting concept of very powerful vampires at the top who are prone to switching quickly at a certain point in their lives, and these elder vampires can only sustain their lives by drinking blood of other vampires. Human blood does something bad to them, so they have what they call vassals, and that concept was also intriguing to me. The idea, oh, you can then explore what it must be like for these feeder vampires, these vassals, to almost be put in the shoes of human prey. But that's not really what Vernon did with this story. It was kind of very convoluted. There was elements of romance in there, but it was like not compelling. I didn't really like the main character. I felt like they were very flat, and I wasn't invested in the relationship that the main character had with the love interest, who is an elder vampire. Ultimately, I think this book also just wasn't really my thing. It wasn't my style, so that's always going to influence my opinions on it. But yeah, I think there could have been some further work done on this before it's published. And it's part of a series, and I would just have zero interest in checking out the series either. It is not my thing, and it doesn't really do anything hugely interesting with this new type of vampire that the author has created. So it's going to have to be an active dislike. Plastic Prism Void by Violet Allen. I've also talked about this book before. I can't get it quite easily up onto the top of the screen, but that would buy a second copy of. I don't have a first copy of it because it is an ARC copy that I received digitally, but the second that this is physically published, I'm running to the stores. I'm so excited to see what this looks like. It plays out on the page. How do I explain this book? I'm going to read what the premise says, even though I disagree with parts of it, but what the premise says is that it is a righteous, trans enemies to lovers romantasy that roars off the page, in which a magical girl gone bad and a renegade mech pilot must find a way to stay on a date forever, even if it means destroying the world. The thing that I disagree with about this, I do not think that this is a romantasy. I don't think this is really a fantasy. This is much more sci-fi than fantasy. Yes, it is focusing on a romance, but I think it is very experimental. It is quite disarming. It is a little difficult and confusing to get into, but I think it is so worth staying with and kind of just accepting that you're going to be put on this ride and stick with it and see where it takes you. It is so funny. You have such a unique main character and a really compelling love interest who is complex and unlikable, but also likable, and there's multiple versions of the same characters, and it is messy. It is so queer and so confusing, and I love it. This is absolutely one of the books that I am looking forwards to seeing released in 2026. The Once and Future Sex by Eleanor Yagana. I'm going to say that I was indifferent. This was the last book club read of Hannah Whittam's Patreon of 2025. It explores feminism and misogyny from medieval ages, kind of through to modern day, but not really. I think the main criticism I have of this book is that it spans such a long period of history that it kind of tackles too much and ends up becoming a little bit too vague for me to grasp specific instances or theories or thoughts of the time. There was a lot of philosophy, and there were elements that I loved, at the same time specific facts that I learnt that I never knew about and probably would have gone a very long time without knowing had I not read this book. But I think this is one of those books, again, wasn't really for me, a bit more historical than I would like. This is another volume of the Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation comic. Volume 9. Right, what happened in Volume 9? Oh, Volume 9 was heartbreaking. I think this one is going to have to go into Delectable because I do remember this one having more action scenes, and I became frustrated again with the depiction of action scenes and how convoluted and difficult it was to understand. I think this volume also had a lot of darkly lit nighttime scenes, which again didn't help with my understanding of what exactly was going on. But it's going to be Delectable because it is a story that I love. We're really in the midst of a lot of the story arcs that I enjoy about the overarching story, so it's going to be difficult for a lot of these volumes to be anything less than Delectable. Hunchback by Sao Ichikawa is going into Delectable. Hunchback is the story of a physically disabled woman who has these very sexually explicit fantasies that she wishes she could carry out, but due to her disability are quite difficult to achieve. And she is a fiction writer, and that is what the book launches you into, is one of her pieces so sexually explicit. It is disarming. This is a very short novella, around 97 pages or so, and it explores the main character's physical disability and her kind of complex, contradictory thoughts on darker or kind of less socially acceptable things that she wants. But these things are only necessarily socially unacceptable due to the fact that she is disabled. So it is a great exploration of the double standards that disabled people face, particularly disabled women. One of the great things about this book as well is just the author herself. She is the first disabled person to win one of Japan's most prestigious literary awards. So it is just really heartwarming to see that. It does have an extremely divisive, somewhat confusing ending that I talked about more extensively in I think it was my November reading vlog, Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This might be controversial, but I'm going to say that I was indifferent. I think I started off thinking that it was good, and I was very much on the boat, understood why everyone was talking about Yellowface. But the further in I got, the longer the story went on, the more I was like, I'm not too down with this. Yellowface is about a white author who essentially steals an Asian woman's manuscript, someone that she used to be friends with, but she witnessed the death of. And this is told from one of the most unlikable protagonists ever, which is an element that I was really excited about because I love unlikable protagonists, especially when they're well written. One of the issues that I had with this book was the pacing. I think it went on for too long, and there came a point in the book where we were kind of putting the main character into new situations that didn't tell us anything different from what we already knew about her, so it kind of felt like we were just going through the motions of making the book longer. The other thing is, it's so heavy-handed. Appreciate that might be part of the character being so racist and kind of feeling the need to justify her bigotry by over-explaining. I think there are a lot of times where R.F. Kuang could have trusted her readers a little bit more to read between the lines. That's why I ended up being indifferent about Yellowface. Let It Snow by John Green, Lauren Miracle, and Maureen Johnson. This is not going to be a surprise to anyone who's watched my most recent video. I'm struggling. It doesn't even want to go in the bin. Get in the bin. Get in the fucking bin. This book sucked. This book sucked so hard, and I cannot believe I ever considered it one of my favorite books. Even reading it in December, it was all seasonally appropriate, and it's Christmas. Fuck you. It's basically like these 3 short stories written by 3 different authors, and some of the stories and characters overlap, set in the same town during Christmas time during a winter storm, and it's supposed to be cozy and funny and light, and it just sucks. The next book I have to talk about is The View from Down Here by Lucy Webster, and I'm going to say that this was good. This is a memoir from Lucy Webster, and she talks about her life, her childhood and the trauma from that, from being physically disabled, going into her uni young adult life, and then going into the professional world as a journalist at the BBC, and all these different facets of her life and how being physically disabled has influenced that, for the better and for the worse. I think Lucy has like a really personable, accessible writing style. It is quite easy to read this book, get into it, and to really feel for her and get behind the messages that she's talking about. I appreciate that it's a memoir. At times I felt that there was somewhat of a singular view, particularly when she widened out to look more at the statistics of being disabled in the UK, for example, and different types of disabilities, and specifically how being a disabled woman has different impacts than being a disabled man, and how even when you're disabled, misogyny adds on top of that, right? Discussing a lot of intersectionality. And I think the fact that this was so singular, despite her placing so much importance on intersectionality, the fact that there were a lot of other communities that she could have talked about and really hammered home the point of intersectionality, it felt like it was kind of like a missing element to this book. And I feel hesitant to say this because it is a memoir, and ultimately it is her choice what experiences she chooses to highlight. And she does mention that she didn't feel like it was as much her place to discuss the experiences of multiply marginalized people outside of her own community. For example, Black disabled people, brown disabled people, trans women of color who are also disabled, so on and so forth. But when you are talking about intersectionality, I did feel like it was a shame that this wasn't brought up, particularly in the current political climate in the UK, with both the rampant transphobia and the attack on disabled people and benefits, for example. There's so much crossover and ripe opportunities to be talking about and to help educate people, because a lot of this book was also very educational. It felt like so much more than a memoir. But I am very thankful that I received an ARC for this, and I think Lucy Webster is a great writer. We're on the last leg, the final stretch. The Husky and His White Cat Season, Volume 10. I'm actually going to say that this was delectable. This is technically the final volume of the main story of The Husky and His White Cat Season. Volume 11 is coming, but that is purely going to be extras set aside from the main story, and actually the end of this volume contained 2 or 3 extras, so again I am very angry at Seven Seas that apparently this could not have just been one mega volume rather than capitalizing on their audience and making a whole separate volume just for the extras. It feels so greedy and pointless, and I'm still going to buy it because I want to read the extras. But this volume wrapped up the main story of The Husky and His White Cat Season. A lot of people were like disappointed by the ending. I think, spoilers, essentially a very important but also considered a secondary character is the one who tells the ending ending of the story. It is from his perspective, and a lot of people were upset because they wanted to basically hear from the perspective of the main couple. And I think this is potentially where the fact that I read a lot outside of Dan May has influenced my opinions on this, because I didn't really mind. I liked the fact that it was told outside of the main couple. I am not primarily a romance reader either, so perhaps those who are really deeply sold on the romance of this story wanted to hear from the perspective of the couple at the end to wrap up the full story, and it feels like perhaps the author was more invested in this secondary character than they were the main couple. But for me, I'm not too fussed about that, so I really enjoyed this final volume. I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hoffman. Can I put this anywhere aside from the top tier? I was super surprised to, when I finally bought this book and opened the front, to realize that this is an older book. This was originally published in 1985? Sorry, wrong decade, 1995. In my head, I thought this was published in 2019 or something, because I'd seen it repackaged everywhere and I thought it was a new book because I just had not heard of it before the new translation. Actually, someone who commented on my Storygraph Reads the World challenge brought this to my attention when I was saying I need a book from Belgium and I don't have any Belgian books. I Who Have Never Known Men is written by a Belgian author. Had no clue. But yeah, whoever commented that, thank you so much for bringing this to my attention. This is technically like an updated translation of the original 1995 book, but it is done by the same translator, which is fascinating to me. This is a post-apocalyptic tale of a bunch of women who are imprisoned underground for 12 years or so, who know nothing about why they're being imprisoned, who they're being imprisoned by, apart from that they are all men who watch them 24/7 by their prison cells, until one day they escape. I know a lot of people think that this is like a nothing book, nothing happens, it is very slow burn. I loved this. This is so down my lane. I am very interested in checking out more of Hartman's work. I am actually kind of mad at myself that it took me this long to check in about this book, but I'm so thankful that I've read it now. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This was delectable. There is something holding me back about loving this book, but I do think it was amazingly well written, very original in its plot. What really sells this book is the chronology, the way that Susanna Clarke has decided to tell this story. It is very innovative, unique, and really keeps you holding on for the mystery and to find out what is going on. Piranesi is the name of the main character who lives in this system of caves with these massive statues, and he has like an encyclopedic knowledge of the endless rooms of these caves, and it's told in a very note-taking form that develops more as the novel progresses. He doesn't know much about the world, and Piranesi thinks and writes and speaks in a very childlike manner, despite knowing that he is an adult. We know that he is an adult, so there's a lot of intrigue in this story to try and figure out where is Piranesi, what kind of world is he in, why is he in this situation. This is one that you just sit and read and watch it unfold. I think I read this in like 3 sessions, could not wait to pick it back up again and finish it because watching it develop and unfold was such a joy. Red Sword by Bora Chung. I'm really sad to say that I was indifferent. I was super hopeful that this was going to be more engaging to me, something that I enjoyed more. Red Sword is clearly drawing a parallel of the Korean soldiers who were employed by the Qing dynasty to fight in a war against Russia, but set amongst kind of a sci-fi background where these prisoners are taken to this alien planet, completely white aliens as they're described, and is forced by the Empire to fight against these aliens against their will. This is very sci-fi. I don't want anyone to think that this is anything other than a sci-fi novel, but it is very simplistically written to its detriment. It's very confusing. It's only made worse by the fact that this is kind of a spoiler, so I'm hesitant to say it, but there is an element, a plot device in this book that makes the simplicity of the characterization and the number of characters difficult, and it makes it confusing. Femme Feral by Sam Beck-Bessinger. Putting this in the actively disliked. This was an ARC copy that I received, but I found out from the author's note at the end, and I think from reading some early reviews after I finished the book, that the author did use some generative AI to write a section, funnily enough, that was supposed to have been written by AI within the novel's universe. Honestly, finding that out really soured my overall opinions of this book. But my issues with this were wider ranging than just that element. Femme Feral is a story about perimenopause, a perimenopausal woman who cannot figure out if her changing body is down to perimenopause or the fact that she's turning into a werewolf. The main character is unlikable and unfortunately not not a well-written unlikable. The story ended up being very drawn out. The main character, Ellie, who's the one going through perimenopause, there's too much of Ellie. Unfortunately, the way that this book is structured, the events that happen to Ellie means that we need to get a lot more of her before we can switch to a much more interesting character, Brenda, who is an 80-something-year-old woman who is a much more compelling, likable character, despite technically being incredibly unlikable in the story. And the structure of this book kind of sets itself up to lose out on more interesting perspectives, and the way that these perspectives have to be balanced out for the story to progress and to make sense means that we just have too much of the main character, who honestly faffs around so much. Spoilers, but she denies or just refuses to accept the fact that she's a werewolf for so long that you're sat there like, as a reader, you know that she's a fucking werewolf, so it's really annoying to sit through. And she's supposed to be a very clever person, to the point where you're just thinking she has to be stupid to not accept the fact that she's a werewolf already. I think cutting this book by like 200 pages would have improved it and made it much more enjoyable. Ultimately, the sections that we used with ChatGPT to write were so insignificant and minor plot points to the story. Literally just like a few paragraphs that the author could and should have just written those sentences by herself. I'm very disappointed about this one. For something that sounded like such a fun, dark concept, it flopped. Notes of a Crocodile by Chao Mao Jin. It was okay. It was okay. This is a Taiwanese novel from the perspective of a anonymous lesbian narrator who has like the messiest lesbian situationship known to man at the beginning of her, I think, university life, potentially at the end of her school life, and how that relationship and knowing that woman has changed her throughout the years in the way that she perceives her other friendships and subsequent relationships. It is split up into parts. There are also like these super abstract references to like crocodiles and a crocodile trying to live its life, and that is supposed to be synonymous with being a lesbian. But they were like so abstract to the point where I kind of lost my interest. The reason that this one wasn't hugely interesting to me is the narrator felt a little soulless, even at times. I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to take from this book. There was just something in here that didn't resonate as much with me as I thought would. Convenience Store Women by Sayaka Murata, one of my favourite authors, would buy a second copy. I have bought a second copy. Convenience Store Women is so popular. I'm sure many people know what the premise is, but essentially follows this 30-something-year-old woman who has worked at a convenience store essentially every day of her life since she first got the job, and it's told from a very rigid, routined perspective, which is very clearly supposed to mirror what it's like to be autistic. Interestingly enough, I read this book before I was diagnosed as autistic and definitely saw what it was going for, but didn't really see much in it. Like I just was kind of like, oh, I don't know if it's the translation, I don't know if it's the author's writing style, I don't really feel much about this book. This was my first Sayaka Murata book, and she has since become my favorite author. So going back and rereading this now was super interesting, and also just to be like, oh my god, this so clearly resonates with me, requiring that structure, that routine to my life and my job. I don't know what I didn't see in this book the first time that I read it. Sometimes you just need to reread a book when you're at a different point of your life. It's so funny and sad and makes you feel kind of empty, but has like arguably like a very empowering message at the end. The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, Volume 10. Top tip. One of the most beautiful covers of the comic so far, by the way, so gorgeous. This contains one of my favourite scenes that happens in this story. The art style was so gorgeous in this volume, significantly so. I was just so excited to read this one. I continued to be excited upon finishing it, thinking about the next few volumes. I do feel like the story has really got into the flow, and the art style has kind of like settled in a little bit more. The guy she was interested in wasn't a guy at all. Volume 1 by Sumiko Arai. This, it got in there at the end of the year. I knew of this manga for a while. Everyone knows about the green Yuri. It's so cute, it's so heartwarming, it's so like low stakes. Absolutely love the color palette. The bright green works so well. It is essentially about this girl who is gyaru, so she's very much like pink, popular, hangs out with all the popular girls, and she secretly loves classic rock music. And this is like something that she feels she has to hide from her friends, or else it would completely ostracize her. And one day she passes by a music store and sees like this really hot, mysterious guy working the desk, and she develops a full crush on him. Only we know as a reader that that server is not a guy, that is a girl, and it is the girl who sits next to her in school. And it's just like a really sweet story following on from there. So good. Absolutely loved it. Hungerstone by Kat Dunn. I think I'm going to put this into delectable. People call it a sapphic retelling of Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which eventually inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. But I feel like I've read some of Carmilla, I haven't read all of it, but I feel like Carmilla is originally sapphic. Right? This is like an explicitly sapphic retelling of Carmilla, following the main character, Lenore, who is the wife of a steel worker, and she is very much under pressure, under the stress of having to assist with this new social standing that she has acquired through marrying her husband. They buy this dilapidated estate to hold like this big hunting party, so the backdrop of this is that they've moved to Sheffield to do up this big house, and Lenore is the one who is in charge of this while her husband is off running the steel mill and being very important and neglectful of her, until one day Camilla shows up and changes the pace of Lenore's life. I am super interested to see what else Kat Dunn writes, because I think this was so masterfully done, so slow burning, but also so oppressive. That kind of slow burn where it's simmering in the background. I don't know how to explain it other than like an urgent slow burn. I'd even argue it's not so much a vampire novel. It is an incredibly rich novel about oppression and freedom and personal choice when you feel trapped in your life. Right, we're on to the last two books that I read, and they were both arcs. Palaver by Brian Washington. This was delectable. This was the first Brian Washington book I'd ever read, and it is a really beautiful, slow, tender book following a son who has moved to Japan, and he has had a very fractious relationship with his brother and his mum who live in America. You don't get to know the name of the son and the mother. It kind of switches perspectives between the two. The mother goes to visit her son in Japan after not seeing him for a very long time. This book is so incredibly gentle and hard-hitting at the same time, and feels like a really reflective love letter to Japan. Part of the reason that this son has been rejected by his family is due to the fact that he is gay. So you get to see the perspective of a black gay man in Tokyo, and kind of the underbelly of the city and the lesser-known gay nightlife bar scene of the city. A love letter written in the way of someone who has grown to build a community and a home in a country that they were not originally born. I don't think this book will be for everyone, but I think it's so beautifully written that it stands up very well by itself. One of the issues that I did have is the fact that the mother and son are never named. The son said this, and he told the son that, and sometimes it gets quite confusing, especially if you're reading like the sex scene. I totally understand what the author was going for, but it does make it a little bit confusing and sometimes does interrupt the flow where you have to think, no, hang on, I'm misreading this. So I don't know if that narrative decision paid off, but it was something that was interesting to read nonetheless. The final book that I read in 2025 was The Hill in the Dark Grove by Liam Higginson, and this is going to go into the delectable tier. This was also an arc. This book is out now, and I'm very excited to see it on the shelves. It is about this farmer and his wife who live in a deeply rural farm in North Wales, and he uncovers on his land a Neolithic ruin that slowly starts to consume him. You see this both from the perspective of himself and then eventually from his wife, who is noticing how he is changing and how he becomes obsessive of these ruins. I'm not going to say any more. It is truly worth the read. It is dark and eldritch and horrifying, and that kind of uncontrollable horror where you can see exactly where this is going to head and you are completely helpless in the face of it. It is very dark and depressing. Admittedly not what I should have been reading at the end of 2025 when I was very sick. I left it feeling very heavy and sad, but that is not a negative thing. If anything, I think that is the sign of a very successful horror book. Oh, guys, okay, we're done. Wow. So, these are the 89 books that I read in 2025. Overwhelmingly full of top tier or delectable tier books. A lot of them you can see that I also was kind of indifferent towards, or I just thought it was okay or good, but I'm not mad about that. Mainly because a lot of those books that fell into the okay or indifferent were ones that I purposely went out of my way to try reading. You know, something different, something part of a reading challenge to try and read different authors from different countries that I'd never read before. I'm really happy with how 2025 went with my reading, and I'm very excited to hopefully read things this year that fulfill me as much as the ones that I read last year. I am going to go now and start editing this mammoth video. If you ended up watching this entire thing, thank you, and I hope that you find some good recommendations from this, maybe even some bad recommendations. Maybe some of these can be your next hate read. Please let me know if you enjoyed this, if you've read any of these books, and if you have any thoughts that you want to share. I love hearing from other people, especially about books that I am super passionate about. Happy January. I will see you another week. Bye bye.